territory of the Coast Salish people, particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continued use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. Thank you all for tuning in. Town Hall is proud to be a community-focused organization and a place where we can share and sustain ideas and creativity, even if it means we can't gather in person. I'd like to thank Astra and Tammy for appearing tonight to help make that possible. Town Hall will continue to produce virtual content as we enter this new year, including our podcast, In the Moment, which features exclusive guests, and many of our past talks are available in video or podcast form in our digital media library. Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. Upcoming programs include our annual celebration of Mozart's birthday, live streamed from the Great Hall, a presentation from journalist John Ghazavinani on the history of Iranian-American government relations, and a discussion with ethics advisor Susan Leotoud on how to make the right choices in our ever-changing world. Check out more of what's coming up at townhallseattle.org. Town Hall and the nonprofit community at large have been put under significant strain due to the event cancellations and ever-changing landscape. We hope you will consider extending your generosity to help support us during this difficult time by making a donation by clicking on the donate button at the bottom of your screen or becoming a member. Our partner booksellers have been hit by the negative effects of the pandemic as well and can use your support. If you'd like to purchase a copy of the book being presented tonight, please use the link on this live stream page to purchase through Estelita's Library. For viewers who want to watch this broadcast with closed captioning, we recommend viewing the stream via our YouTube page linked here in the chat. To enable real-time closed captioning, click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. Tonight's presentation will be about an hour, including Q&A. Questions will be selected from those submitted in the Ask a Question field at the bottom center of your screen. We will also take questions submitted in the YouTube chat. We cannot guarantee that we'll be able to address every question, but we will try to get to as many as possible. Please keep your questions concise and in the form of a question. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our Civic Series is supported by Real Networks Foundation, True Brown Foundation, KUOW, the Norcliffe Foundation, and Wyncote Foundation Northwest. Finally, Town Hall is a member-supported organization, so I'd like to thank all of our members watching tonight. Astra Taylor is a documentary filmmaker, writer, and political organizer. She is the director, most recently, of 2018's What is Democracy, an exploration of the philosophy behind the concept of democracy from ancient Athens to modern Greece and the American Civil Rights Movement. She is the author of Democracy May Not Exist, But We'll Miss It When It's Gone, released in 2019, and 2014's American Book Award winning The People's Platform, Taking Back Power and Culture in the Digital Age. She is co-founder of the Debt Collective, a union of debtors, and contributed the foreword to the group's new book, which will be discussed this evening. Tammy Kim is a freelance writer with articles appearing in many publications, including Al Jazeera, The New York Times, Politico, and The New Yorker, among others. She covers topics ranging from art, culture, and politics. She is a former attorney for low-wage workers and an adjunct professor. Kim earned her education from Yale, the NYU School of Law, and grew up in Tacoma, Washington. A new book written by the Debt Collective, Can't Pay, Won't Pay, The Case for Economic Disobedience and Debt Abolition, is the topic of this evening's talk. Please join me in welcoming Astra Taylor and Tammy Kim.
Thank you so much. Thanks to Megan and Candace and Bruno for putting this together and for Seattle Town Hall's staff in selecting this program. And hello, Astra. So nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Yeah, I want to echo the thanks to Town Hall. I'm a big fan of your programming and echo the call to have community members support what you do.
Great. Bruno's going to help us with a brief slideshow tonight. Bruno, if we could get that started. I thought I'd provide just a little bit of background before I get into conversation with Astra, because she and the Debt Collective have been responsible for so much. In celebrating this new book, Can't Pay, Won't Pay, which was recently released by the radical publishing house Haymarket Books, we have the opportunity to talk about one of the most inspiring, successful social movements of the past decade. Bruno, slide, please. It was in the fall of 2011, in the wake of the nationwide mortgage scam and bank bailout, that activists began to occupy Wall Street and organize for economic and social justice. Out of this, people who were underwater, in debt to lenders of all kinds, came together to analyze what this debt meant. They concluded that our trillions of collective consumer, student, and medical debt was not a matter of personal choice, but rather a mandate of our deeply unequal global capitalist system. Slide, please. Strike debt began to convene people in debtors' assemblies, imagining a kind of labor union for people stuck in our financialized economy. They used creative legal tools to target frauds, including predatory for-profit colleges, such as Corinthian, ITT Tech, University of Phoenix, and Trump University, and eventually abolished more than $1 billion, again, more than $1 billion in unlawful debts. Slide, please. The debt collective also transformed what was once a completely taboo, shameful identity, that of a debtor, and I know Astra and I have struggled with our own student debts, into a call to action. And after many years of organizing, abolishing debt is now a national policy objective discussed at the highest levels, including the recent presidential election. Slide, please. Currently, members of the debt collective are on strike, refusing to pay unjust loans and calling on President Biden to quickly address this crisis. The strike is also part of a larger set of demands, which we'll discuss tonight, for the human right to housing, education, healthcare, and the environment. Slide, please. Astra has been involved with the debt collective since the start, and she writes a beautiful introduction to this new collectively authored book. We're so pleased to be in conversation with Astra tonight. Welcome.
Thank you, Tammy. That was such a kind introduction. It actually made me a little emotional to see it because it's 10 years from the beginning, from Occupy Wall Street. That was 2011. And it's been a lot of hard work, hard work on this idea that initially, when we brought up the demand for debt cancellation, when we started to politicize the condition of indebtedness, we were really mocked and scorned in the media. It just struck people as so outlandish, even though there's a long, not just centuries long, but thousands of years long tradition of jubilees, of canceling debts. And we're part of that trajectory. But it's been an interesting road. And I was recounting actually to Tammy, just for people listening, that I think my first email to you was like 2013 and saying, please pay attention to us. We're doing this crazy thing, and we need support. We need stories written about what we're up to. So thank you for answering my crazy email that came out of the blue, and following us with just attention, because I think a lot of times activists, part of the work of activism actually is trying to get ideas out there, and then other people take credit for them, or they just become common sense.
Right.
Well, you guys work's kind of erased.
Yeah, you've certainly just injected into this idea into the discourse, and I think we're seeing so many fruits of that right now. So it's just really wonderful, as proof of what activism can do. I thought, just to orient us, you could start by reading a bit from the book, and then maybe elaborating on this idea of the debtors' assembly as a form of organizing, because I think that's really the core of this.
Yeah. Okay. So this book is called "Can't Pay, Won't Pay: The Case for Economic Disobedience and Debt Abolition," and this is the product. It's co-authored. We jokingly called ourselves the writer's block as we worked on it. So the co-founders of the Debt Collective wrote it together. But it's actually, there's so many more authors in this book. This is the product of collective thinking that goes back to Occupy Wall Street, so at least a decade. There's so much learning in here from people who we collaborated with. I mean, David Graeber, the great anthropologist who passed away in September, who was a dear friend and recruited me to this movement, and many of the other people involved. But more than David, I mean, people who came and did something sort of essential, but then, left their mark, but then couldn't be involved around the clock. So this, and all of the people who went on strike, first from the predatory for-profit colleges, all the people whose lives have been touched by this, they're all in this book. And I really believe in thinking as a collective enterprise. I mean, that's something I'm very attracted to about activism. Activism isn't just doing. It's not like mindless action. It's actually collective thinking and collective imagination. So instead of reading the part I wrote that has my name on it, which is the preface, I just thought I'd read a little bit of the chapter that's actually called "You Are Not Alone."
Perfect.
Which is the first real chapter. Okay, this is the section called "The Myth of the Good Debtor." Our economy is built on lies. We're told that debt offers an opportunity to get ahead, when in reality, most people spend their entire lives stuck on a debt treadmill. Take out student loans to go to college so you can graduate and get a good job. Borrow money so you can build your credit score and buy more stuff. Take out a mortgage so you can become a homeowner, become an entrepreneur with a small business loan. Debt is presented as a crucial rung on the ladder to a better life, a stepping stone to the American dream. If we can't dig our way out of these good debts, we are to blame. But the fact is that most people can't dig themselves out. 3/4 of people take their debts to the grave. Americans die holding $62,000 of debt on average. The capitalist fable of upward mobility has always been an illusion. While leveraging debt has lifted some out of poverty, access to credit was a cornerstone of policies that helped create the white middle class, let's not forget. The majority has been left behind or pushed into predatory contracts they can never escape. Debt, however, is more than a trap. It's a form of social control. To give just one example, in 2019, the US Army actually admitted that they exceed their recruiting goals by targeting students in debt. As an Army recruiting commander, General Frank Muth put it, quote, "One of the national crises right now is student loans. So $31,000 is about the average. You can get out of the Army after 4 years, 100% paid for state college anywhere in the United States. In other words, to be indebted makes us vulnerable to predators of all kinds, including predatory lenders, predatory debt collectors, and predatory military recruiters. In myriad ways, debt erodes our freedom and forces unbearable choices on us. Should I pay my mortgage or pay for my chemotherapy? Should I take out loans to pay for college or enlist in the Army to get financial aid? Should I put groceries on the credit card or be late with rent? Should I go to a payday lender or should I sleep in my car? We internalize the narrative that we've taken on debt freely and the burden is ours alone to bear, when nothing could be further from the truth. To be indebted is typically a shameful experience. We are hounded by collectors via telephone and mail, our credit scores plummet, and along with them, our chances for housing loans and even employment. Our self-esteem, self-worth, and physical and mental health take a dive too. Being indebted weighs on body and mind, stressing us out and making us ill. Statistics bear this out in a very shocking fashion. That's not an accident. A loan is a weapon for making us feel powerless. It continues, but I think this is all stuff that's even more profound in an age of COVID and economic crisis. There are a lot of pauses and moratorium on evictions. They're not totally working on suspensions of student loans, but the problem is a lot of these bills are going to come due. And people who are already struggling to pay are going to be even deeper in the red. The question of assemblies, which is all, I think that part leads to it well. This movement begins with a personal sort of revelation. So, the old feminist slogan, the personal is political. Those bills you pay at the end of the month that seem so personal and so overwhelming, you're afraid to open your mail, you're afraid to see what's inside, are actually political. So we are not poor because we live beyond our means. We are poor because we're denied the means to live, right? Medical debt doesn't exist in countries with universal healthcare. We don't have the services we really need. The minimum wage doesn't pay for a one-bedroom apartment in a lot of cities, right? So another way to say this is being poor isn't the result of poor choices. It's because of the structures. It's actually very expensive to be poor. It's the structures that create this concentration of wealth and at the other end of the spectrum, economic desperation and deprivation. So we begin always by inviting people to overcome that shame and tell their stories, because there's a lot of shame. That's part of the ideology of indebtedness. There's a morality of debt, right? You have to be a good debtor. You have to pay no matter what. And so the first step before you start organizing and building power and thinking of strategies and legal mechanisms and all this is to come together and realize you are not alone in that double sense, alone or alone, that other people are in the same boat, and that we can either sink individually or come together and try to fight for a different system. So we do a lot, this is the endless work of this kind of organizing, is inviting people to tell their stories, and then something shifts and you see yourself in a political, shared collective context. Right? Your story, it's overwhelming, but it's actually probably not that unique. And this happened to me at Occupy. Like the second or third day I went to Occupy Wall Street, I will never forget the image and sound of this young man. And he said, step right up and write down what you're worth to the 1%. There's a big piece of paper. He had tons of markers. And all these people were stepping up and they were writing $120,000 of student loans, $45,000 of medical debt, $300,000 underwater mortgage. And I had this like that I would have to write down this number that to me felt so overwhelming. First off, I realized, wow, I don't even have that much. It was like $45,000 a student loan.
Right.
But the way that this person, I would love to know who this was, but the way he said, not just what do you owe, but what are you worth, was also something that caused a switch to go off, because I realized, yes, you're right. My debt's a form of profit. Every interest payment, every fee is actually, my debt is someone else's asset. And that's a core insight we try to get across in this book. So maybe we could show this clip of this film. I just launched this film today called You Are Not Alone. Why let a good slogan go to waste? It's on theintercept.com. And it was shot, it was one of the last things I did before the pandemic. It was a convening of activists and academics. And we were a year ago thinking, wow, we pushed this idea of student debt cancellation onto the national stage. Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are saying they're going to do it. And we didn't, Joe Biden later has come around a bit. And we were really thinking, like, what's next? But it begins with people telling their stories. So we could just show a very short segment from that.
Great.
I'm a student debtor, but I'm also a former employee of the for-profit education system. And so I was a whistleblower. I was in financial aid for 13 years, but I still managed to get $180,000 in student debt.
I started at Cal State Northridge, and I had a full financial aid package. I'm a survivor of domestic violence, and so my household disintegrated in a certain kind of way. And I had changed something on my FAFSA. Just like one little question asked me if I was a ward of the court. And I was like, I don't know what that means, And so I was thinking my dad's incarcerated, so I was trying to figure it out. And I changed it and they audited my FAFSA. And so then I came in and they said, what's your situation? Who's this information on your FAFSA? And I said, it's my aunt. That's who takes care of me. And they're like, no, you can't. That's not your guardian. What the hell are you talking about? This woman pays the rent. They said, no, you have to contact your father. So I had to write him a letter. I had to stick my FAFSA in an envelope and mail it to a prison in Tennessee. Wait for that to come back. And so then I missed that whatever that registration was. And so when I came back to school, I lost my financial aid and I had to take out all of these loans. It was like $25,000.
Thank you so much for that. I do encourage people to watch the full video, which is just about 45 minutes. It's just extremely enlightening about all of the interconnections with debt. Astra, we could go in so many different directions, but I thought one place we might start is with the second speaker, whose story I found especially touching. And, he talks about, he's really highlighting here the intersections between different kinds of debt. Because, one kind of debt I didn't mention in the introduction and we haven't talked about yet is criminal legal debt. There's all these different social systems that basically pull us into debts. Could you talk about that, maybe the sort of student debt, consumer debt, criminal justice debt intersection, especially I think in the time of Black Lives Matter, this is very pressing.
Yeah. I mean, the Debt Collective, in fact, somebody uses exactly this sentence. I'm just going to rip off the movie. The Debt Collective is not just a student debt organization.
Right. Yeah.
We organize around all kinds of debt. It's. I think first it begins with the analysis. And the analysis that something changed in our economy in the late 70s and the 80s. And we know, all of us, I think, know this statistic that wages started stagnating, right? That there hasn't been real wage growth. I mean, the minimum wage in this country is so obscenely low. It hasn't been raised in almost 10 years. So it's worth, because of inflation, it's worth even less than it was, 10 years ago. But so you've got stagnating wages and you've got a tax on labor unions. You've got jobs moving overseas. And so what happened is credits was then used to kind of provide this illusion of shared prosperity, right? Mm-hmm. That's when credit cards explode and people start charging things. Also, at that point, there is a very real attack on public education. And so we see student loans exploding as well as state funding for education diminishes. And so we see just people debt financing more and more things that they need to survive. One way of saying this is that we moved from a welfare state, an imperfect welfare state in my book, but some semblance of a welfare state, to a debt-fair state.
Yeah.
Because we know, it's not, it's college was much more affordable in states like California. It was basically free to anybody who wanted to go to the tripartite system there. So we have this new system where people have to, again, debt finance the things they need to survive. And we see this in, as I already said, student loans, medical debts, right? Because we don't have a system of universal healthcare. The leading cause of bankruptcy in the United States is medical debt. And this is something where you're like, why is this even treated like a debt that can ruin your credit score? It's not like you choose, like, I would love to charge some chemotherapy today. That's just not how it works. I'd love to go into debt for a COVID treatment or something. But also this financialized system has its tendrils in the criminal legal system in ways that are really troubling. One example of that, when Ferguson erupted in protest, it was discovered that one of the big causes of the discontent was the fact that the city, seeking revenue, instead of taxing, more affluent tax base. I mean, part of the problem is that because of the way the lines of the jurisdiction were bound, there were very few affluent people. But they did this regressive thing where they were catching people on small trivial violations, like a broken tail light, or in one case, a story I'll never forget, a woman's lid was off of her trash can, and then issuing fines and fees. And using this to extract revenue from people. So the criminal justice system became a source of regressive taxation. And this was something that was affecting people in an almost unimaginable way, if that's not the way you engage with the state. People on average leave jail carrying, I think the statistic in this book is over $13,000 of criminal justice debt. Think, for example, of Florida, where the people of Florida voted to re-enfranchise former felons, right? This was a victory for democracy. This was one of the best democratic votes of recent years. Well, what did the Republican legislature do? They said, not for people who haven't paid their debts. Right. They disenfranchised debtors being those who still had criminal debts to the criminal justice system. So this is why there's a big fight over cash bail right now. The Debt Collective is actually about to build a tool that will dispute cash bail in California. I mean, this is the thing. There are different laws for different states. It's a complicated thing to start kind of unwinding and tackling, and you've got to look for these levers of powers of where people have rights that they aren't able to use. But this points to the bigger racial dynamics of debt. And so there's statistics, right? What is the population most burdened by student loans? Black women. Intuitively, this makes a lot of sense. Black families have far less intergenerational wealth to draw on. And then there's wage discrimination that's both racialized and gendered at the workplace. So Black women are paid 61 cents on the dollar compared to a white man. So what happens then is that recent graduates, Black women will hold, a few $1,000s more debt immediately out of school. And that will just balloon because of the way interest compounds. So white students are better able to pay off their debts. And what happens to a lot of Black graduates is they are put deeper into debt. And this is even more unfair when you think about the fact that Black students often need a college degree more to just get their foot on the door, right? Yeah. You need that degree inflation to even have a fair chance of getting the same job as an uncredentialed white person. The racial dynamics are everywhere. I mean, look, as I said, at the way that access to federally backed reasonable credit was what built the white middle class, right? So think about the government programs to issue mortgages in the New Deal era, right? Black families were left out of that. Those loans that were actually pretty fair. So there was discriminatory lending. Then, of course, there's the history of redlining, where you target a Black community and either deny them credit or offer them credit at very exploitative terms. But it goes even further back. There's just endless examples of this. Yeah, but I think one really important example of this is sharecropping, and the way that debt was used after the end of slavery to enforce a system of racial hierarchy and domination. And so debt has this deep political dimension. We have to face that dimension head on, the way it has been used as a form of social control. So it was like, well, yes, formal, slavery is behind us, but now you're going to be trapped in this incredibly unfair, racist economic contract where you'll never get ahead. So you're tied to this land, you're tied to, and you're kept impoverished and unable to not just build wealth, but have a political voice and challenge the terms of these contracts. So that's, part of this, as I said, long history of debtors revolting goes back to the beginnings of democracy. So it's debt financialization has taken a new form post the late 70s. We call this era of financialization. We call it neoliberalism. It's all ways of saying that debt is more central to the economy than it used to be. But it's also, you have to understand, it's still part of like this old story that is incredibly racialized and racist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. In a way, I think your book does a really good job of doing this. That can be kind of used as a tool to understand our economic history writ large, like all the way back to the beginning of this country. Kind of moving forward, you guys talk about a reparative path forward, a reparative way of reconstructing our thinking about social goods and public goods, the welfare state. What does that mean, and why is that important?
Yeah. This really owes to one of the co-authors, Hannah Appel, who is an economic anthropologist at UCLA. And she insisted that it wasn't enough for us to simply say we want public goods or we want universal goods. So, for example, in our fight now for student loan cancellation, we say we need Joe Biden to use the power he has, which he possesses, to cancel all federal student debt. He can do this with a signature. This is an authority Congress gave the executive branch long ago and gave the Department of Education long ago. And then we want to couple that with education as a public good, tuition-free quality education for all. Her point would be that we need this system that we want to fight for, right? Our horizon of education that's not just free as in price, but free as in liberating, free as in aimed at making us more free. It has to take into account all of these past inequities, these centuries of harm, and how the not just past but present inequities. And so we have to have a quality not just of universality, but of repair, of reparations. And how do we imagine public goods, social services that do that work, that are for everyone, while understanding that everyone's not equal. So we can lift people up and have that aspect of redress built into our social systems. And I think it's a really interesting question, because what we get locked into these days is sort of means testing, right? Which is like, but create some arbitrary limit to make it fair. And what happens is people get arbitrarily left out. And then it creates more bureaucracy. And so, we could do a whole segment on means testing and why I typically think it's a bad thing. That's not the same thing, right? It's not like, it's really, I think points towards a reimagining of the state and what these things are that we need to actually in this crisis of indebtedness. What would a medical system, what would a system of universal reparative healthcare look like that would take into account all of these disparities? And the fact that there's environmental racism that has health consequences, right? The fact that we know that Black women are, more likely to see their children suffer from infant mortality because of systemic racism in the profession. So that's something I think that is there as kind of, we want to always be practical, like here's a way to fight, here's your leverage, here's the legal theory, here, and we've done a lot of policy wonkery, but then we also always want to have that political horizon and imagination as well.
Yeah. Just one quick note on the means testing part, because one of the more public critiques of the debt collective's work has been that the cancellation of student debt would be regressive, that, you were saying that student debt most affects Black women, but the critics will say, yes, but en masse, most of the debt of students is held by white people who are now set up to work high-paying jobs. So why cancel that debt? Because, they don't need it to be canceled. Yeah. Could you speak to that notion of, whether this is a progressive or a regressive policy?
Yeah, well, and also, the worry is always that some person with a law degree like you, Tammy, might get their debt canceled, and that would be the end of the world. Okay, so I hate this critique that canceling debt is regressive. So let me just tell you that Betsy DeVos, who I'm sure everyone here loves, one of her last acts was this farewell letter where she spoke her truth. And one thing she said, and it's essentially a quote, she basically said that ignore these calls for mass debt cancellation. It will just benefit the wealthy. This is from a woman we had to fight to give to debt relief that was legally required to students who had been preyed upon by predatory for-profit colleges. She wasted years and years of their lives. And when we finally beat her in court, also the lawyers we were collaborating with found her in contempt of court, she finally issued the loan cancellations, and she wrote next to her signature, "with extreme displeasure." So this is a woman, she's never not liked the policy because it favored the wealthy. But here's the thing. Truly wealthy people don't have student debt. Truly wealthy people are able to pay for college. They're able to pay up front, which means they pay less, because the more you borrow, the more you pay. So for example, I was on a podcast today with one of the Biden Jubilee 100 debt strikers, one of the people 100 people have declared themselves on debt strike in this under this new administration. She borrowed $40,000, and that's how much she owed when she graduated 5 years ago, and now she owes $80,000.
Right.
So a student from a wealthy family that could pay cash up front would have paid that $40,000, right? But she, being Afro-Latina who lives in the Bronx from an immigrant family, right, has double that amount 5 years out. What is her life going to be like in 10 years, in 20 years? So student debt is regressive. Canceling it all is progressive. And the thing is, we want doctors and lawyers to have debt cancellation, because then they can serve the public interest. There are so many people, again, there's so much research on this, that shows that doctors go into fields where they'll make more money. Lawyers have to work at corporate firms to pay their debts. There's a shortage of dentists in rural areas because dentistry school leaves people with so much debt. So it creates these incentives where people actually can't do the things that might benefit society as a whole, right? Like we want doctors to be able to just be general practitioners, right? We want lawyers to be able to be public defenders. But people from working class backgrounds or communities of color have a really hard time taking on all that debt and then doing public service work. So it creates, there's actually a wonderful doctor who's on strike, a young Black doctor from Miami. And his point is that that medical school debt actually prohibits not just Black students from becoming doctors, but then also doing the kind of public interest work that he's committed to. He owes $600,000 from medical school because he came from a poor family. So yeah, cancel it all, but it's also about education being a right and a public good. In this moment of democratic crisis and a crisis of thought, which I think we are having as a society, it's like we need to get out of this idea that your school, education is just training to get a job so you can get enough of a salary to pay off your student debt. We need to, I'm a radical. I want to break that idea and be like, what is education really for? So the film that we showed the clip from is in 3-second sections. It's called Debt. It's the first section, education, and then liberation. What is education for? We've lost sight of that as a society, and student debt is part of the infrastructure that is obscuring that real purpose.
Yeah. I have more questions for you. I just want to take a moment to invite the listeners also to submit your questions. You can do that through the Ask a Question function here or on YouTube, and those will get funneled to us. On the note of kind of what's happening now, Astra, obviously, we've responded with, tragic consequences, very poorly to this pandemic. And now more than 420,000 people have died in this country. And I think most of, our policies in this regard have been pretty atrocious by international standards. But, one small exception to this maybe, and you spoke a little bit about it earlier, is we've had an eviction moratorium. We've had, certain suspensions of different kinds of debt collection. We've had $600 monthly federal unemployment payments, even to freelancers. We've had, direct payments that are better than ones we've achieved in the past. So in a way, this is a package that is slightly better than what we saw in 2008, where truly only the banks and large corporations seem to have been bailed out. And I wonder if, I've talked to, I think, a lot of radicals recently about maybe people from this have kind of gotten a taste of what universal goods might look like. It is possible for us to not be evicted. It is possible for us to actually get a few $100s a month even, to try to live better lives. What do you see as potentially like this opening up for us right now?
Yeah, I do want to encourage people to read your great reporting like you have done a lot of pieces that contrast our response with what's happening internationally. And I think that part of activism is this imaginative work. It could be different, people. And your reporting is that way too. Like, well, let's not get too stuck staring at the navel of the United States. Remember, there are other ways of organizing society. I mean, the meaning of any event is up for debate. And that's, that's part of what organizing is about, right? Is that you're battling for self-understanding, for interpretation of events. And so I think in this moment, there are powerful ingredients if we can manage to seize them, right? And to kind of form a meaning around them. One way of understanding what we want to do at the Debt Collective, and this I really crystallized for me in my last conversations with David before he passed away, is that, we're challenging the ethos of the indebted. We want to encourage a feeling of being entitled, right? I mean, this is the part of the, I think, conservative ideology is saying, you're not entitled to any help. Right? It's not just, you're bad because you're poor. It's like, you're not entitled to help. Nobody should help you. You're alone. And, and if you go to the state, it's a sign that you're weak. And we want to cultivate a sense of entitlement. And so I think this moment is really interesting because just tens of millions of people have benefited from these checks. I was reading a history of the unemployed movements after the Great Depression, and it took people years and years to mobilize for the unemployed to get organized. And there were kind of spontaneous groups of the unemployed, and then also communists and socialists started organizing the unemployed, and some trade unionists. It took years for people to finally be like, we're so desperate, we need to demand some relief. And so it's quite interesting, so in that sense, okay, it's great that people got these benefits. But, what we say at the Debt Collective is that, they were inadequate. So there's a lot of data on how much of people's checks they actually spent on debt payments. So in a way, it was a roundabout bailout of the creditors. So I would say from the Debt Collective's perspective, we want cash to the people coupled with debt cancellation. And this is where these suspensions and pauses and moratoriums don't go far enough. Right? So back rent is all going to be due. Back mortgage payments are all going to be due. So we've, in some sense, punted on this crisis. On the other hand, there's this imaginative opening because you're saying, guess what? Student loans were suspended and the sky didn't fall. Right. The Department of Education didn't crumble. So again, this is why there's something here if we can make something of it. And certainly, I hope we can destigmatize these benefits and these relief programs and just show, they're needed. They're needed to make society resilient. There's no shame in them. And actually, they could be even more generous. Instead of a one-time, these checks should be recurring instead of acting like they're just so special. Because people in other countries got a lot more than we did here. So, but I think we're in a struggle over what this experience means and, if it will be remembered and how it will be remembered. And that's part of what I think we're trying to do as culture makers too, right? It's not just activists who do that.
Right. That makes sense. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about the organizational forms that you guys have practiced. So, the way that you guys have described it as, as we said, kind of like the style of a labor union, that we could have a debtors union in which there's membership. But you guys have a huge geographic reach, and it's not that you're, in one place. So how do you make those connections, and how do you build campaigns? What is the participatory structure of the Debt Collective?
Yeah. In some ways it's a work in progress. I'm not going to lie. And in some ways I'm like, how am I getting asked this? Like, I'm a filmmaker. I just one of these people who
now.
I guess I'm just one of these people who I couldn't live with myself if I just sort of was like, this should happen. This should happen. Like at a certain point, you're like, look, if you think it should happen, fucking do it, So it's not totally figured out. I would say we've run pilots, right? So what we've tried to do is say, what if debtors organize the way workers organize? So the labor unions, there's no denying that they're essential to creating a degree of equality in a society, economic equality, and also democracy, right? We've seen as the demise of labor unions has occurred, we've seen this, the rise of oligarchy, basically, of corporate power and a de-democratization of our politics. There's lots of social science research to back this up. The model of worker organizing is really interesting. Workers come together, you form a union, you negotiate with the boss for higher wages and benefits. Well, since debt is a form of wage theft, in a sense, right? Because we're charged interest because we need to borrow to survive. So there's already a connection to the labor movement there. But a lot of people are in debt who don't have a chance to join a labor union. And I believe that they need to have a way to engage with the economy, to say, we want the economy to be different. And so debtors don't share a workplace, but your debt sticks to you, whether you're unemployed or not, whether you go to school, whether you retire. So it's a little harder to organize debtors because you're not in one place with one clear boss. But because your debt sticks to you, you can organize people who come from very different geographies, from very different walks of life. So our membership is very diverse. If you look at the Biden Jubilee 100 page, you'll see these are all kinds of people from all over the country. And so it's a kind of organizing that's actually really suited to this moment because everything's virtual. So we have, people can sign up and join the union, debtcollective.org. There's meetings all the time. Our focus right now, because of capacity, we're a small organization, run by a group of just people who decided this is their hobby. But we're focused on student debt cancellation because in our earlier campaign around for-profit colleges, we realized that there was something called compromise and settlement, this authority that Joe Biden can use, and he can direct his Secretary of Education to use to cancel all student debt. And so it's student debt is something, because it's owned by the federal government, there's like a clean, easy demand, right? And Joe Biden has promised to immediately cancel $10,000 and then to do more substantive relief for certain types of borrowers under a certain income bracket. So that's our focus, and we're building out this union. And so we run something called the Jubilee Schools, so political education. We have some nascent chapters forming in certain places. And we're trying to build, the constituency that is really committed to pushing this issue, which involves doing things that we're all familiar with, like contacting your representatives, getting your friends to also contact their representatives to sign petitions, but also more disruptive forms of action. So we had a protest on January 4th outside of Joe Biden's headquarters in Philadelphia. And, from studying history, I think one of the lessons is, you have to challenge power, you have to be disruptive. And so that's why the phrase economic disobedience is there. On the one hand, sometimes you have to strike. You have to say, hell no, we're not going to pay. And some people might say, oh, but what about the financial consequences of that? I think one of our main points is that we want to politicize conditions people are already in. A lot of people are already suffering the worst consequences of default and trash credit scores. So over a million student debtors default every year before COVID. So that's potentially 1 million new debtors a year for our union. Who are already on a kind of strike. So we're figuring, how this model would apply, for example, to medical debt. Medical debtors could target specific hospitals or target the federal government demanding Medicare for all. We're going to start organizing, as I said, around criminal fines and bail bonds in California later in this year. So there's actually, when you start nerding out, there's so many targets at the state and local and national level, and potentially tens of millions of members.
Yeah, everyone, please join. Astra, we're getting some listener questions that are really terrific. So maybe we'll go into a bit of a rapid Q&A part of the evening. Let me start with this question about universal basic income. We sort of touched on this really, in this initial conversation about the stimulus package. How does this intersect with the UBI? And do you think universal basic income is something we're potentially moving towards?
I'm quite encouraged by the conversation about universal basic income. A lot of people, I'm not saying anything original here when it's sort of like, well, the devil's in the details, right? So if you're talking about a universal basic income that is inadequate, and then the terms of it being passed or that we cut other forms of social services, then I don't want anything to do with it, right? But a robust universal basic income coupled with all of these universal reparative public goods that we're talking about, I think would be great. And I think that's a fight. I think given the relief, the unemployment insurance, and the checks that we saw this year, I hope that becomes something that people can imagine and feels more possible to them, right? So I'm enthusiastic about it. I do think too that I kind of said this when I said we need these cash payments coupled with debt cancellation. If we have universal basic income, then we sure as hell need to get people out of debt, because otherwise all this income is going to go to is paying back all of people's. It's just going to go to the creditors. So I think there's actually quite an interesting synergy there between the demands that we need cash and cancellation. And the point is to give people a floor, so that they can live a dignified, basic life. I also always say that we have to couple the demand for minimum income with a maximum income. I'm not interested in a minimum income of 20 grand a year if there's a couple of trillionaires running around, and we are really on the verge of that, right? So sometimes I'm like, maybe we should put our emphasis on the maximum income, which FDR talked about. FDR used that language, and there were points where our tax rates were so high at the upper end, they effectively were.
That's right.
A maximum income level.
Yeah.
So I want to revive that. So I would say, yes, cash and cancellation, minimum income, maximum income.
Great. Thank you. And thank you to Kelly for that question. Hannah asks whether you could talk about sovereign debt, and how is this discourse around the federal deficit always growing and things like that? How can we understand that and fight against that misconception that is the same as sort of individual debt?
Yeah, I mean, how you just phrased it kind of gets at it. We need to be careful about analogies, and the right wing loves to analogize the federal government to public debt. They love to analogize public debt to personal debt. And they'll be like, the country's in debt. When you're in debt, you have to tighten your belt. You have to cut things. And then that, of course, is like, well, and of course, what are they going to cut? Not the military. They're going to cut schools. They're going to cut healthcare. They're going to cut the minimum wage. They're going to impose what's called austerity, right? They're going to use the national debt to impose austerity policies on people. And again, tons of research shows that austerity inhibits economic growth, it inhibits GDP. So it becomes this vicious cycle where austerity creates a drag, and then the economic situation gets worse. So, when we started out doing the debt resistance, before we were even the debt collective, the right really owned the debt narrative, because there was like a whole debt ceiling debate, and they shut down the government and all of this stuff. That's really shifted. I mean, the fact, this is something where, okay, I'll say a silver lining about Joe Biden. He said we shouldn't be afraid of deficits, right? There's now a kind of sense that, there's a kind of revival of what Keynesian common sense, I guess, that when the federal government can spend. That's because the U.S. has monetary sovereignty. Not every country has that. Canada has that.
Yeah, that's true.
And so so for example, I made a film called What is Democracy? Town Hall did an event with me a few years ago about it. I look at the Greek sovereign debt crisis in that film. We actually write about that here in the book. There's a chapter on municipal debt, so debt of cities, and also international debt. And in the case of Greece, they didn't have monetary sovereignty. They're in the EU. And so it was a crisis, and there was more austerity, more cuts, and all of this. So the politics of debt are also played out on the international stage, and we were inspired, of course, by these global Jubilee campaigns of the early aughts. I mean, when I was a baby wannabe activist, and I remember going to this big thing around canceling debt for the global South, because that's where you really see the way after the decolonial movement, and so countries throw off the yoke of colonization, and then neocolonialism comes in and imposes debt on developing countries, and manages to, and so there's this predation again that plays out. So anyway, it's a complicated issue, but I think we need to resist the rights narrative that public debt is something that's a terrible thing in the United States.
Thanks. Yeah, and I appreciate the historical note that, we haven't always been here thinking that way. We have a question from YouTube about how debt cancellation, plays into the discourse around reparations. And I assume here we're talking about reparations for slavery in this country. Yeah. Do you guys see those in parallel, or are they potentially conflicting as policy aims?
Oh, I think actually there's a philosophical point here that we make in the book. We're not against all debts. In a way, the way our debt contracts are structured now, so many of them make it hard for us to pay our true debts, or we just don't talk about our real debts. So we see reparations as a real debt that needs to be paid. I think that's part of when I say, we're for universal reparative public goods. Part of it is that racial consciousness, right? It's that actually, how do we structure our healthcare system, our education system, so that they pay attention to these disparities? So true debts could be not just reparations, but, for example, climate debt that rich countries like the United States owe, because we have burnt through far more than our fair share of the world's carbon and profited as a result. So I think one thing that is interesting to me is that we often say this year, or 2020, I guess last year, that we're in a moment of racial reckoning. And I always am struck by that, because it's a word that's said all the time. We're in a moment of racial reckoning. Reckoning actually means to reckon one's debts. It's actually a language of indebtedness. And I think what that means is that reckoning isn't just like a recognition, right? Like, oh, I see that harm was done. It's like, pay your debts with policy, with public money, right? With a material transformation. So to me, this reckoning is part of reparations. It's part of us being able to do a kind of moral accounting and figure out what our real debts that we're not paying are. So we can pay them and make the people whole who deserve to be made whole, instead of making people richer who don't deserve to be rich in the first place.
I love that. Yeah, it's such a shift in the way that we've been taught to think about, owing.
Right. Yeah.
A couple more questions here. Donna asks about how the cancellation of student debt right now will affect future students. So, is this something that moves forward, or would the only thing that affects them be the free college?
Yeah. So that's part of the political drive and debate. So, you could cancel student debt multiple times, you being, whoever is in charge, Joe Biden's administration, right? It's something that can be done over and over and over again. We think that we should get at the problem by instituting free college, so that future generations don't go into debt to begin with. Right. I think it's important that we stand behind debt cancellation, even if we can't pass the perfect policy that solves everything at once, because it's the opportunity to puncture this phony morality around debt and to say, look, actually, guess what, government? The government can cancel these debts. Debts can be canceled at scale. Right now, when we think about the demand for Jubilee, we have to go back and say, in ancient Samaria, there were mass jubilees. Or there are other recent examples. After the mortgage crisis, Iceland wrote down mortgages for some people. After World War II, the debts of Germany were written off. So there are moments, but I think it would be very powerful to be able to say, and then in 2021, the government was forced to cancel some debt, because this idea that debts have to be repaid as long as you're a working and poor person is very fundamental to our unequal economic system. Of course, rich people walk away from their debts all the time. I mean, look at Donald Trump and his astonishing history of bankruptcies. Look at the banks after the mortgage crisis. Look at the corporate debt that was written down by the government last year, right, with the first coronavirus bailout. So there's a double standard there. The rich always are able to use bankruptcy and to leverage their debts. But I think some sort of policy that would show that actually debt cancellation is possible en masse for regular people would change the terrain that we would be fighting on, right? It wouldn't solve everything, but it would get us closer. And I think it would help build momentum towards something like college for all, getting us back on track towards education as a public good.
Great. As a final question, we have a question from Kate, who asks about a very specific proposal that Elizabeth Warren has put forward with regards to taxing the assets of the extremely wealthy. But maybe we could just broaden the impetus of this question, which is basically, how does tax policy and the taxation of the rich, you mentioned that, the highest income brackets in this country at different moments have been taxed, in fact, at 80-90%. How does that intersect with this goal that the Debt Collective has of overall economic justice and debt abolishment?
Yeah, I mean, I see that. I see taxation primarily as a way of reducing inequality. Why do you want to reduce inequality in a democracy? It's because extreme wealth gives you extreme power. So we all know this. We know the rich are able to set the political agenda. Taxation is a way of reducing that. It's a way of imposing a kind of maximum income. And states and cities need to tax residents for their budgets, right? The federal government has the power to print money. So, I think we have to, in a way, it's like we don't always have to say, oh, we need to tax people in order to do what we want. Like we can do a lot of what we want with the public purse without taxing the wealthy. We want to tax the wealthy because we want their money to do better things. We want to use it for socially productive investments, but also because we don't want them to have this inordinate power that distorts the decision making and the priorities of this country, because we know that they hoard money and then they're trying to seek some place to put it, but it's never what is actually good for society as a whole. It's where they might find a return on investment. So I think taxation's, incredibly vital and important. But I think we need to remember that we don't, we can do things. I mean, the government spends huge amounts of money, and the government could write a totally different budget. Stephanie Kelton, who is one of the people who worked on the first College for All Act, and she's in this film that's on The Intercept. She's fond of saying a budget's a moral document. It's a reflection of our priorities, right? And, again, I think our priorities should be equalizing political and economic power so we can have something approaching a democracy. Call it socialism. I'm fine with calling it that. I like that word. But that is something, taxation too is not, it's not something that's just limited to the national stage. I mean, this is something that has terrible international consequences. Offshore banking is something that doesn't just harm people in this country, it harms people all over the world. And so I think it's a whole system that needs to be tackled, and it's certainly something that we're allied with at the Debt Collective. And the thing is, there's no single silver bullet, there's no panacea, there's no one approach, right? Like I do this work with the Debt Collective, knowing other people are working on elections, knowing other people are working on international tax policy, knowing other people are working on climate change, knowing other people are working on labor rights and organizing, and other people are, public defenders, and we all have to just do our bit to try to take down the Goliath. There's not one strategy that's the answer. We have to do it and have humility and know that other people are also holding up their little corner and trying to get us closer to that, that horizon of a more just and less fractured and fractious society.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's such a wonderful note. And I would also just say on the tax piece, I think this is a very meaningful question in Washington State, where this event is being virtually held, given that Washington State does not have an income tax and that all of the taxes are essentially regressive in the state. So much justice to fight for in the tax system at all levels. Bruno, I was wondering if you could bring back up the slides. I just wanted to reiterate that, I think just as Astra just stated, that this debt struggle is intersecting with so many different movements. This book just does a really wonderful job of, explaining all of that and explaining how, a housing struggle is a debt struggle, a criminal justice struggle is a debt struggle, and how all of these things sort of interface. So I encourage people really to pick this book up, and the link is through the Seattle Town Hall site. And also just here a shout out to David Graeber, who has been a mentor to Astra and the Debt Collective. Rest in peace. His masterwork, Debt, The First 5,000 Years, is a must read on this subject. Slide, please. Here are Astra's most recent projects, which she's mentioned briefly, but they're both really brilliant works, this film and this companion book. So I encourage people to pick these up as well. We can just start our Astra fan club right here. There's many more besides. Next slide, please. And finally, I wanted to shout out a project that Astra and I are both involved with. We are starting a brand new glossy magazine that is devoted to feminist socialism. I've been joking that this is like Vogue, but with politics. So same glossy pages, but none of the fluff. Please subscribe and support us. We would really appreciate it. Thank you all so much for attending tonight and for supporting the work of the Debt Collective. Thanks again to the staff of the Town Hall, who have just been so courteous and professional through all of this. And Astra, thank you and congratulations to you and the collective on all of the work you've done to bring about more justice in this world for all of us.
Thank you. That was such a fun conversation, and thanks for all of your generosity. And I'm so happy you remembered to mention Lux at the end, because it's also, I mean, I'm speaking as the old lady, trying to encourage the next generation, and so everybody subscribe if you can.
Thank you. Thank you, Candace. Turn it over to you now.
Yeah, thanks so much. I just wanted to pop back in and thank you both for presenting tonight. There's no one who is not touched by this. Everyone has experience with this.
Yeah.
So I hope it really resonated. And, you know, one of the things I was thinking about as you were both speaking is how this affects our relationships. You know, I appreciate all of the philosophy you bring to this, Astra, that, you know, the moral conundrums that we face with this, and on like every personal level, this just affects, you know, parental, child to parents relationships. And wouldn't it be great if that stressor wasn't, on those? So
100%.
So I wanted to thank the audience for watching as well. Click the buy the book button if you're on Crowdcast, and there's a link in the YouTube chat for the book. If you can purchase through Estelitas, that would be great. Support a local bookstore. I also have, and I'm going to post in the chat here, a link to the full video that we saw a clip of. So I want to encourage everyone to go see that as well. If you're interested in more Town Hall coming up, you can visit our website, townhallseattle.org, and see more events coming up. So thank you both so much. Hopefully we'll be able to host you in person in the future. Stay safe and well. And thanks so much again for your work and your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.